The very last thing that we're going to do this year with decimals is we are going to learn how to divide whole numbers divided by a decimal and a decimal divided by a whole number. Next year in 6th grade, you'll do a decimal divided by a decimal, but this year we're just going to focus on whole numbers and decimals. Now, when we divide whole numbers and decimals, we're not going to go above the hundredths place. So we're only going to go 2 decimal place values to the right of the ones place. So let's talk about what that means. Let's look at 2 different equations. I want to look at 2 and 35 hundredths divided by 5. And I also want to look at the equation 78 divided by 3/10. Okay. I challenge you guys to pause the video and talk about or think about what you notice about the equation. The first thing that I notice is that the division problem at the top is a decimal divided by a whole number, and then the division problem on the bottom is a whole number divided by a decimal. And a few months ago, we learned how to divide whole numbers and fractions. And about after 2 or 3 days of exploring this, you guys said, well, Miss Montrose, I've noticed that every time I divide a fraction by a whole number, it ends in a fraction. And anytime I take a whole number and I divide it by a fraction, it ends in a whole number. And you guys kind of figured that out on your own after a couple of days of exploring these different equations. And I'm just going to start off by saying you'll notice the same thing when we do decimals as well, when we divide up decimals and whole numbers. So what I want to point out is that in the first equation, it starts off as a decimal, so it's also going to end in a decimal. Your quotient's going to be a decimal if you want to use your vocabulary. And in the second equation, it ends in a whole number, so our quotient is going to be a whole number. And I want you to stop and think to yourself, what does it mean when I divide something? Okay, let's look at this first equation. Right, 2 and 35 hundredths divided by 5. Well, I'm really taking 2 and 35 hundredths and I'm dividing them into 5 equal groups. And what I'm determining is how much belongs in each group. And then when I have the other equation, 78 divided by 3, 3/10, I'm taking 78 and I'm dividing it into groups of 3/10. And I'm trying to figure out how many groups I have. And that is the purpose of division. We know that with division, it matters what order it goes into, because depending on what order it goes into is depending on what we're figuring out for our answer. So again, since we don't have a lot of manipulatives or anything, or we don't have any exactly, because we're not at school, and unfortunately I didn't have enough to send everyone home with a pack of them, but I'm just going to show you guys the standard algorithm with this, because you are going to have to know it for 6th grade. So let's move on to that, and I'll show you how to complete the quotient. Alright, so let's look at what our first equation was again. 2 and 35 hundredths divided by 5. Okay, and we know that we're trying to take 2 and 35 hundredths and we're dividing it into 5 equal groups. So you guys actually can do this using the standard algorithm. So let's set it up. Remember, your dividend is what you're dividing up, and your dividend actually goes inside of your division sign divided by 5. Okay. I do want to note that when you are dividing decimals, you do have to use the standard algorithm. So those strategies that we used at the beginning of the year when we were dividing whole numbers, the partial quotients method and the box method, actually do not work with decimals. So I do want you guys using the standard algorithm for this. And one thing that we do want to note is that when we have a decimal and we're dividing it into equal groups, one strategy that you are going to use to solve this is when your decimal is inside the division sign, the very first thing you're going to do is to move that decimal straight up. Kind of like when we add in subtract decimals, but the same thing, but you're going to move it up instead of down. Now that that decimal has moved up, we can start dividing. Well, let's talk about how many times 5 goes into 2. Okay, and stop and think for a second. And how many times 5 goes into 2? Well, it doesn't. So we know that when we just divide as normal, we're going to go to the next place value. In this case, you're still going to go to the next place value. So now we're trying to figure out how many times 5 goes into 23. Okay, well, I know that 5 goes into 23 4 times without going over, just like normal division. And we're going to follow the same rules, and you guys can do does McDonald's sell burgers if you want to. I know some of you like to use that strategy. Okay, so we divided, we multiplied, or we're multiplying now. 4 times 5 is 20, and you're going to subtract like normal. I know that 3 minus 0 is 3, and I'm going to bring down my 5. Well, 5 goes into 35 7 times. Let's start it over. I know 5 goes into 35 7 times, so I divided. Let's multiply. 7 times 5 is 35. Subtract, that is 0. I know that I don't have anything left in my thousands place. My remainder is 0, so my answer is 47 hundredths. All right, so let's look at our other equation. Let's talk about what it looks like if we have our whole number in the beginning. 78 divided by 3/10. Okay. Now this is going to look a little different because our 78's going inside, because at this point we're dividing up 78 wholes into groups of 3/10. So 78 divided by 3/10. Now if you notice, there's no decimal underneath the division sign. So when our decimal is on the outside, it's going to look a little different. Let's talk about how we're going to solve this. You remember when we were multiplying decimals and we talked about how we could move the decimal to the end to make it a whole number? Well, we're actually going to do the same thing with this one. Okay, so when the decimal is on the outside, you are going to move that decimal to the end to make it a whole number. So now instead of 3/10, it's 3. Okay, now you can't do something to the divisor without doing something to the dividend. Well, here's the trick with this. If I have a whole number 78, I know that my decimal is on the right side of the ones place. Okay, so what I'm actually going to do is going to move my decimal over again and fill in this little blank spot with a 0. So instead of 78, I now have 780. Essentially what I did is I just multiplied each side times 10 to make it a whole number. All right, now that it looks like a regular whole number, now I can go ahead and divide it. I know, let's go ahead and set this up because I know some of you like to use it. Does McDonald's sell burgers? All right, so let's divide. 3 goes into 7, it does. Well, I know that it goes in there 2 times. After we divide, we multiply. 2 times 3 is 6. After we multiply, we subtract. 7 minus 6 is 1, and then bring down my 8. Okay, let's start it over again. 3 goes into 18 6 times. 6 times 3 is 18, and subtract. Now don't forget about this little 0 over here. You still have to bring that 0 down. And this is where a lot of you still have trouble sometimes. We want to start it over because we did still have to bring down a number. It's okay for you to say that 3 goes into 0 0 times. And now let's finish it out. Multiply 0 times 3 is 0, and subtract. And I always like to slash my 0 through it once I've closed it out when there's nothing else to bring down. Okay, so 78 divided by 3/10 is 260. And essentially you are saying that 3/10 fits into 78 260 times. Okay, I would like to try that a couple of more times. Let's look at the equation. Let's look at 96 hundredths divided by 4. Okay, and remember our dividend, the number that's being divided up, goes inside of your division sign if we're setting it up as the standard algorithm. Divided by 4. Okay, we're taking 96 hundredths and we're dividing it into 4 equal groups. Let's figure out how much goes into each group. Okay. Well, remember, if the decimal's on the inside, we're going to bring it up. It's the very first thing you want to do. Okay. Try not to get it confused on what you do when the decimal's on the outside. We'll talk about that again in a second. Okay. Does McDonald's sell burgers? Okay. All right, let's go ahead and divide. That is our first step. 4 does not go into 0, but it does go into 9 2 times. Okay. 2 times 4 is 8, and subtract. 9, multiplied and subtracted. Sorry, I was moving too fast. 9 minus 8 is 1, and let's bring down that 6. And let's try it again. Let's start it over again. 4 goes into 16 4 times. Multiply. 4 times 4 is 16. Subtract. 0. I don't have anything else to bring down, so I know I'm finished. So 96 hundredths divided into 4 equal groups. There are 24 hundredths in each group. All right, I would like to look at one more where you have a whole number, such as 55, divided by a decimal like 5 hundredths. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about how I set that up. Well, remember, we are taking 55 and we're dividing it into groups of 5 hundredths, and we're trying to figure out how many times 5 hundredths fits into 55. So let's go ahead and set that up. My dividend, which is what's being divided up, goes inside your division problem. So 55 divided by 5 hundredths. Well, this time my decimal is on the outside, so the very first thing that I want to do is to make that a whole number by moving it over twice. Okay, so instead of 5 hundredths, I now have moved my decimal over to the end. So it's the same thing as saying 0.5 or 5. Okay, so 5 is now my divisor, and then whatever I do to the outside, I want to do to the inside. Well, 55 is a whole number, so technically our decimal is invisible. We know it goes at the very end because there's really nothing over here. And I also want to move that 2 spaces to the right. So move it to the right, move it to the right. Fill in those spaces with zeros. Okay, so now that I've moved it over to the right 2 times, it now is 5500 with a decimal on the end, or 5,500. Okay, so now we have made those whole numbers. So now we're ready to divide. Okay, does McDonald's sell burgers? All right, so let's go ahead and divide. 5 goes into 5 one time. Okay, 1 times 5 is 5. We multiplied. Now let's subtract. 0 and bring down. Right, 5 goes into 5 again. We start the cycle over, divide. 5 goes into 5 again one time. Okay, multiply again. 1 times 5 is 5, and subtract again. Okay, now we have some numbers that we need to bring down. So even though it says 0, I'm still not finished. Still need to bring down that 0. Okay, it's okay for you to say that 5 goes into 0 times. Okay, now let's go ahead and multiply again. 0 times 5. Sorry about that. 0 times 5 is 0, and subtract. Okay, I still have one more place value I need to bring down, so we're not done yet. Okay, let me move this up a little more. Let's have a little more. There we go. Okay, so I bring down that 0. 5 goes into 0 times, and then multiply again. Now I don't have any more numbers to bring down, so now I can cross it out and be done. So 5 hundredths fits into 55 wholes 1,100 times. I hope this makes a little more sense to you. I am going to post a couple of other instructional videos that I have found that I think will be helpful for you guys, that I found on Khan Academy. And I'm going to review the Brain Pop one again. I think there's a Brain Pop one that I want you guys to look at as well. If you guys don't see a Brain Pop one on my teacher page, then just disregard that point. But I know there is one on Khan Academy that I think will be beneficial that I want for you guys to watch as well. And of course, you know, I'm always here. My office hours are going to be every week on Thursdays from 2:30 to 3:30. So I'll always be available or during office hours. I'm also available at any point during the day. Your parents can always message me. We can always FaceTime. I know with a couple of you, I've done like almost like extended office hours where we've gotten on Zoom and we've talked about a couple things that you guys needed clarification with. So I'm always here for you guys. Please call me, message me, email me with any questions you may have, and we will get through this together. I know this is probably one of the more difficult things that we'll do this year. So, just remembering all the rules and stuff is pretty tough, and it's even harder online because I'm not there with you guys to help you explore and play with different manipulatives and really grasp the concept of it. So I completely understand that. So please shout out if you need any help with anything, and I'm here for you guys. And I hope you're doing well, and I hope you're staying healthy. Miss you guys. Bye.